Before I start, there is a movie that came out about this case somewhat recently. It has Judd Nelson and that woman in the from that sitcom with the really tall guy in it, Till Death, Jolie Fisher. Anyways, I started to watch it, but as soon as I realized it wasn't really accurately following the story, then I stopped watching it. So all of my research is from online news sources. There's actually quite a bit written about this case and often in German. So it's not really easy to distinguish fact from fiction on it because it is a really unbelievable story. Like it sounds like fiction, but I can assure you that it is not. The movie that I'm talking about, it's called Girl in the Basement, if you're interested, and I think it's on the Lifestyle Network. It's a TV movie, not a big screen one. There's a number of books about this case as well. There's one called I'm No Monster by Stephanie Marsh and Boyan Pinsinski, and The Secrets in the Cellar by John Glatt. And those books might be more recommended and closer to actual facts if you're a reader and you want like a really deep dive into this case after you hear about it. There's a lot to go through in this, and I just simply can't go through every single detail without doing like 10 episodes on it. But I'm going to try and give you the most important details on this case. On the evening of Saturday, April 19th, 2008, an ambulance was called to a large gray stone house in Amstetten in Lower Austria, which is about an hour and a half drive east of Vienna, Austria. It's on a street that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, to attend to a teenage girl that had been dumped by her mother on her grandparents' doorstep, unresponsive and very gravely ill. So the girl was rushed to the Amstetten hospital. She was unconscious with kidney failure. She was really close to death. Now, the girl's grandfather, Joseph, the one that had called the ambulance, trailed behind her and then um, showed the doctor. His name was Albert Reitner. This note that had been left with the girl, that apparently her name was Kirsten, saying, "Please help save her. She is very scared of strangers," and asked her to stay strong and she would be back for her. So Joseph was absolutely beside himself, not like he didn't know what to do. And it wasn't actually the first time that his daughter Elizabeth had dumped off a child of hers on their doorstep. Elizabeth had actually run off about 24 years earlier and joined this cult. And over the years, she had left a baby named Lisa in 1993, and then another girl was dropped off in 1994 named Monica, and then a son named Alexander in 1997. Now, so each time that a baby was left, it was always left with a handwritten note saying that she hadn't been able to care for the child, and then each time, the grandparents would take the baby in, lovingly care for it. Um, Joseph was married to a woman named Rosemary, who was clinging to hope that by caring for her children, that one day Elizabeth would, return to the family. Joseph and Rosemary had reported her missing years ago, but the police had been unable or unwilling to locate her. And she had always refused in her notes to say where she was. But now here is this child that is actually much older than any of the other babies that had ever been abandoned by her before. And there's no records of her existence at all, like no birth certificate, no paperwork with her at all. Kirsten had arrived at the hospital. She was unconscious with multiple organs failing. She was having seizures and needed to be put into a medically induced coma to just try and save her life. The doctors notified the police of her arrival, not because she was having kidney failure, but because the young girl, she was described as a teenager, looked more like an old woman, like she had some missing teeth, bleeding gums. She looked like from malnutrition. So she looked malnourished. Her skin was like the palest white that they had ever seen. She had clumps of her hair missing, as well as scabs on her lips from repeated biting of her own lips. Kirsten had clearly been suffering from years of neglect. In addition to the coma, she had also had to be put on a respirator and given dialysis because she was suffering from a lack of oxygen. I could never find the exact cause of her um, medical distress, but it was rumored to have started from a bad asthma attack. So, once notified of this really bizarre situation, the police put out a public appeal on TV and newspapers asking for Elisabeth Fritzl to come forward because she might have information that could save Kirsten's life, like her medical history. But they also hoped to find her so that they could, of course, question her about how Kirsten's condition could be the way that it was. Like, what was this cult and how were they treating children there? There was a really strong suspicion that this was going to be a case of criminal neglect. The most recent letter that Elizabeth provided from Joseph was dated from January of 2008, and it had come postmarked from a town called Keemeton. Now, while trying to track her down, the police contacted a man named Malfred Wolfart, who was an expert on cults and particularly in Austria and around Europe. Now, he said that he wasn't able to pinpoint which cult she might be in, and that her letters just didn't seem quite right. They had been dictated by somebody or something. Like the writing was really odd. Normally, cult people they will mention the religion for sure. Um, and this never mentioned anything about her specific beliefs. So this kind of furthered this mystery of who this Elisabeth Fritzl was and what she had done to this child. Elisabeth Fritzl had been born April 6, 1966, to her parents Joseph and Rosemary, who had married when they were 21 and 17, respectively. And before having these extra three mouths to feed, they already had a pretty large family. So before Elizabeth had been even born, Ulrich, her older sister, had been born in 1957. Rosemary Jr. had been born in 1960. Her brother Harold in 1963, and then Elizabeth in 1966. Then she had another sister and another brother that joined the family in 1971, twins. There was Gabriel and then Joseph Jr. And then in 1972, the last sibling Doris, was born. So two parents, seven kids. It's a little bit of a household. Now, her parents had been born during World War II in Austria, which was not a great thing to be born in Austria during World War II. Joseph had been born on April 9th, 1935. His father had been an alcoholic and abandoned the family when he was only 4. So he grew up with just his mom. His mom worked really hard, but they often did live in poverty. Now, apparently, his mom, Maria, had been left by her first husband because she hadn't been able to have children, but then had Joseph with this other man, and then Joseph is what they call an alibi baby. Basically, she didn't want him, but she needed to prove that she could have a baby. And so when the Germans invaded Austria, it wasn't considered a bad thing by most Austrians at that time. So, and Maria had sided with the Nazis, but for some reason or other, she got herself arrested and sent to a concentration camp when Joseph was quite young. So he went into foster care for a bit, but until the war was over. But then she was freed. So she came back with a bit of a temper and emotionally broken, you could say, which can't blame her. Not a lot is known about Rosemarie's background other than she was pretty young when she got married, which wasn't exactly scandalous back in 1956, which was the year that they got married. Joseph's father went on to fight in World War II on the side of the Nazis and then was killed in action in 1944. Uh, Joseph didn't really care that much about it. He really loved and revered his mother. Seeing her, he saw her as an example of like a perfect woman, but he also lived in fear of her because she had a pretty bad temper and was pretty controlling. But being the product of a broken home and living in poverty didn't keep Joseph down at all. He managed to get a degree in electrical engineering at the HTL Technical College, worked for a Volstapine in Linz from 1969 until 1971, and then became a technical equipment salesman and was able to retire by the age of 60. The family also purchased a cabin at a campsite at Lake Mondes, which they rented out until 1996. They also purchased their house in Amstetten, which operated as both their home, and then they rented out units in it. So the seven Fritzl kids grew up in a rather wealthy lifestyle. And then over the years, he did a number of renovations on this property. Elizabeth had always been a rather feisty young woman. She had finished high school at 15, taking courses in culinary arts. And then, while away at her studies in January 1983, she actually ran away from home. With a friend of hers to hide out in Vienna. And her parents reported her missing. She was found. She was returned home 3 weeks later. And once back home, she kind of settled down a little bit. She was still unhappy with her family life. She finished her course, took a job working in Linz, which was nearby the Fritzl house. But by the summer of 1984, just after she turned 18, she disappeared again. Now, Rosemarie and Joseph reported her missing to the police, but seeing that she was 18, she had run away before as a teen, there wasn't really much that or was being done about it. Joseph had mentioned in the weeks leading up to her disappearance that she had been researching alternative religions, and he was worried that maybe she had joined some kind of cult. So, about a month after she had last been heard from, her distraught parents had received a letter from her. It was the first of many letters that they got from her over the years. Now, in this first letter, she said that she had left to join this religious sect and that they shouldn't even try to look for her, which was just as Joseph had suspected had happened. Now, Rosemary was beside herself with grief that Elizabeth had left the family. She had been very close with her family up until then, for this group of religious wackos, and like she just prayed each night that she was going to come to her senses and come back home. Now, for 24 years she prayed that she would come home without ever laying eyes again on her sassy brunette daughter, only to get these handful of letters over the years. Now, needless to say, they were beyond shocked when 9-month-old baby Lisa was found outside the Fritzl's front door, partially hidden in some bushes, with a note pinned to her little sweater from Elizabeth, imploring her parents to please take care of her, that children and education were not valued where she was. So they gladly did that. And Austrian social services, they didn't really question it, because grandparents take in their children's children all the time. So on December 15th, 1994, Monica appeared on the doorstep, exactly the way Lisa had been found as well. So Rosemary took that baby in as well, and then again in 1997 when Alexander showed up. So all three of Elizabeth's kids were taken care of by the grandparents, in the years that they should have really been enjoying their retirement. Then in 2003, another letter arrived. Now, this one was not attached to any baby's sweater, but was just kind of a birth announcement that she had given birth to a fourth child, which was a boy born in December of 2002. So, who exactly is this Kirsten, and where does she kind of fit into this sibling pack? And why had she shown up on her grandparents' doorstep after so many years? And where was Elizabeth, like her mom? During the days that followed, Kirsten was in a coma. She was unable to talk or tell her anything about her story. And then, surprisingly, Elizabeth showed up, with her father on the 26th of April. She was a petite, white haired woman in her early 40s, the same snow white, pale skin that her daughter had, same missing teeth. She had a posture of an 85-year-old woman. So Dr. Reitner, feeling that there's something really sketchy going on about this situation, so he tipped off the police, and both Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and taken to the police station for questioning about the suspicion of child neglect here. So Elizabeth was stone faced and acting kind of strange at first. She refused to say more than she had joined this cult. She had walked away from her kids. She told them very little about what had led up to Kirsten's, like her problems with the organ failure. But finally, she relented a little bit, when told that she's likely going to lose her children for good here. So she said that she would tell her story, the whole story, and nothing but the truth of her story, but that they had to promise her that she would never have to see her father again. And they promised her this, and then she started to tell her story. So Elizabeth began by telling the police that Joseph, her father, had been a strict disciplinarian and that her and her siblings were afraid of him, like he was a tyrant. But for some reason, she seemed to have gotten kind of the worst of it. And at the age of 11, Joseph had started to sexually abuse her. Now, he started doing this by leaving like porn magazines at under her pillow and then masturbating in front of her before moving on to full on sexual assault, which he did pretty much every night to her, and not just nightly, but sometimes in the car, while Rosemary's in the kitchen, like just any time that the desire struck him, which apparently was pretty often. He spied on her, he stalked her, he just basically controlled every aspect of her life. So by the time she was 15, all she wanted to do was be out of her parents' place, particularly because of her father. So one night at work while she was waitressing, she had sort of unburdened herself to this coworker, and the two of them hatched this plan to run away to Vienna, but she had only made it away a few days, maybe a week before the police tracked her down, and then as missing person under the age of 18, she had to go home. So what she did after that was she was determined that as soon as she turned 18, she was out of there. And she was really close to being 18. She was finishing up the training that she needed to do for this waitress job that she'd gotten. So she was going to save her money, leave her parents' house, hoping that she would never have to see her father again. So she started to make a plan to move to Linz to live with her older sister, Rosemary. Only on the afternoon of August 28th, 1984, Joseph told her that she needed her to help him lift this door into its frame in the basement. Joseph was working on some kind of project, like some kind of renovations down there. Like no one knew what he was doing down there, but he had told everybody to kind of stay away from it, which was fine for all of them because the less time they had to spend with him, the more time their life was just better. So he told the family that, so he told the family or anyone that asked that he's building this nuclear bunker down there, which um, actually kind of made sense in the 1980s, right? Like, it was the height of the Cold War and all. And the Austrian government actually helped subsidize the work if you were making a bunker at the time. So she's a little bit curious. She trudged down the stairs to help him out with his door. And it was a really heavy door, so she had to hold it while he secured it in place. And then he swung the door open, and the next thing that she knew, there was this smell of ether, a cloth over her face, and everything just went black. And then when she woke up, her arms were tied behind her back. She could only move like maybe a few feet to either side of the bed that she was on. It was a really dark room, no windows. It smelled dank down there. And before she had really even fully regained her senses, her dad had returned to this little makeshift basement. It was a prison, basically, is what it was. He viciously sexually assaulted her repeatedly. So after 2 days of being chained by her wrists, he actually gave her a little bit more mobility by attaching the chains to her waist instead. And it was it was not actually because he cared so much about Elizabeth's comfort, but because it was it was easier access to what he wanted to do with her. Um, and that's how the indictment actually reads. So he proceeded to sexually assault her several times a day, bringing her little bits of food every other day or so until about 6 months in, when he finally removed the chains, let her kind of wander around this small little prison. It was kind of a suite that he had sort of built. It had like a small hot plate in what I guess he would hope would pass for a kitchen, had a little toilet and a sink. There's no windows and no escape. And he told her that the door was booby trapped to unleash this deadly gas if she ever tried to escape. And then for the next 24 years, that's where she lived, being sexually assaulted every day when her dad would come down at 9 a.m., just like clockwork. And the cops are like, "When? Like, 24 years?" And she says, "Yep, 24 years." Then in 1988, sometime she got pregnant that year, and she had to give birth with no medical attention and completely alone to Kirsten. Then the following year, she got pregnant again. She gave birth to Stefan, who lived with her in this underground prison. Then in 1993, she got pregnant yet again to a baby girl named Lisa. Now, this time things were getting a little bit crowded in this tiny little basement, and Lisa was a baby that just cried more than Joseph cared for. So he made her write a letter stating that she was still in this cult, but that she couldn't care for Lisa and begged her parents, like basically her mom, to take Lisa in as her own. So Joseph then took Lisa away, told her that her mom, Rosemary, would be adopting her. And he was actually rather pleased to discover that adopting Lisa actually made it came with a monthly check. Um, but the monthly check would have been bigger if he had fostered Lisa instead of formally adopting her, so he was not gonna be making that mistake again. So in December of 1994, when she gave birth again to another baby girl named Monica, he did the same thing with her, and, Elizabeth never saw her baby again, um, but was told that she was being taken care of by Rosemary. So fast forward to 1996, she gives birth to twin boys in this cellar, alone again with no medical care. At this point, she had not seen the outside world in 12 years, nor breathed actual fresh air. She had named the boys Michael and Alexander, but Michael had actually not thrived very well and had passed away within hours of his birth in her arms, probably from something that a medical doctor could have treated. So Joseph threw the baby into the incinerator, told her that whatever will be with children. And then Alexander, the surviving twin, was taken to live upstairs with Monica and Lisa. In 2002, she gave birth to her last baby with her father as the father. Little Felix was born, but apparently, according to Joseph, Rosemary had her hands full with the three other children, grandchildren, children of Joseph's. So Felix stayed in the basement with Elizabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan. Now, with the arrival of each baby, although she was horrified of the conception of her children, she did actually enjoy the company, and having children sort of gave her a purpose. So she tried to teach them reading, writing. She also tried to shield them from the fact that they were living this imprisonment. Over the years, Joseph had actually provided them with a TV, and Elizabeth had already told them that the images that they were seeing were just kind of a fantasy world. They weren't real. He gave her some medical books from the 1960s and a pair of scissors to help her each time she was going to give birth. And then in 2008, they had all gotten sick with a really bad flu, probably brought in from Joseph in his daily visits with bringing in all these foreign germs that they had no immunity to. And Kirsten had gotten really sick, and then Elizabeth had begged Joseph to take her to the hospital, or else, like, he's going to end up on murder charges here if she died. So he had relented, and then he took her. But when the news started running all these stories that they needed to help save Kirsten, she then begged him to let her go, um, and see her. So that's why she's there now. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, the police are looking at Elizabeth like she's completely lost her mind. None of this could possibly be true. Like she's making all of this up to avoid looking like a bad mother. So, meanwhile, Joseph's in another interview room. He's telling them that Elizabeth joined this cult many years before. She's a bad mom, refused to tell anyone where she was, kept dropping babies off on their doorsteps. But when the officers tell them that Elizabeth is telling this very different story, he says, "Okay, sorry about my family, but it can't be undone." Like, he no, so he denied sexually abusing Elizabeth. He told them that, yes, he kept them in a cellar, but it was only because at the time Elizabeth was going down a wrong path. She was slutty and doing drugs, so he had to keep her safe from all of that. And actually, Elizabeth would have sex apparently with anyone. She was super slutty. So after a few years of it, he just couldn't control himself anymore. And apparently, they had, according to him, consensual sex and that their relationship was perfectly normal. And it was pretty normal to keep a family in the cellar. Like, what's the big deal here? So it was her idea to have kids with him. He just went along with it. He took very good care of them. He fed them. He spent time with them. And he basically felt like they were this family. And he feels like he saved Kirsten, right? I mean, he saved her from her slutty lifestyle. I mean, she would have died if not for him. And then he says, and by the way, I haven't had sex with Elizabeth for many, many months. I was going to let them go anyways because I'm just getting too old for this shit, basically, is what he's saying. So I feel like I kind of washed over some really important stuff here. Like, what was going on for those 24 years and what is Joseph's malfunction? So let's go back a little bit here. So Joseph's grandmother was named Anna, lived a pretty normal life until she married the owner of a mill who was rich, had servants, all that good stuff. But Anna couldn't have kids, or at least she didn't get pregnant. So instead, he wound up impregnating one of their servants. Well, that's actually a little bit misleading. He actually sexually assaulted one of the servants who fell pregnant. And then he quickly fired her and then gave the baby to Anna to raise, which he did with two other servants. All three of the children were given to Anna, forced to raise them as her own. Anyways, we're not really off to a great start with this family. So Maria was the result of one of these sexual assault incidents. And Joseph would go on to take his mother's last name, Fritzl. She was not a great mom. She beat him a lot, and Joseph was terrified of her until he was 16. And then he stood up to her and he actually struck her in the face. And then after that, the tables like seriously turned. And then Joseph would go on to physically and verbally abuse his mother. Now, there are rumors that there was some sexual abuse going on as well. Joseph was often quoted as saying he managed to suppress his urges around his mother. Now, spoiler alert, Joseph grows up to be the biggest sicko that I have ever heard of. As a teenager, he became what we would call a flasher. So he would walk up to a woman at a park in like a, I don't know, like a trench coat or something, nothing on underneath, and then expose himself to women, enjoying the reaction of shock and horror that they would have. But then he met and married Rosemary and did very little to hide his proclivities for the depraved from her. She was a very demure woman. She was very shy. She was also very easy to manipulate and lie to. She just kind of always went with whatever he said, doing whatever she was told. But Joseph, of course, didn't treat her particularly well. He was always calling her fat and demeaning her. And he would get his sexual fix by stalking women, exposing himself to women, and basically being a complete creepo. Then he started stalking this young nurse and who was a mother, and he broke into her house by coming through the window and watched her sleep, and then went into the kitchen, got a knife, crawled into her bed with his pants down, and then sexually assaulted this poor woman. Now, he was arrested and charged and pled guilty to that, but he was only given 18 months and served less than a year before being back at home with Rosemary and the kids. And then to make matters worse, sexual assault at that time in Austria is wiped off your record after 10 years. So Rosemary just kind of pretended the whole thing had never happened. She forgave him his trespasses against other women. And so she really had no issue with him going to brothels, sometimes in countries like Thailand, where he could indulge his sick and disgusting desires with very young girls and sometimes boys. Um, and as she grew older, he took his mom in to his house, which he was sharing with his wife Rosemary and all the kids. Um, But he might have taken her in, but he certainly didn't take care of her. For the most part, he locked her in the attic and then boarded up the windows so that she was forced to basically live in a dark room for hours and sometimes days at a time, very much like he did with Elizabeth and the kids. Now, somehow he managed to keep really good jobs and amass quite a bit of wealth over the years while dominating his family and keeping them under his iron thumb. He completely invaded their privacy. He beat them all rather mercilessly. So each kid moved out pretty much the day they turned 18. And Elizabeth was supposed to be the next to move out, leaving her horrible family life behind. But what she didn't know, or I guess no one really knew, is that this underground bunker that he's building had nothing to do with the Cold War at all, or the threat of nuclear war. And this goes way beyond any kind of man cave. It was a dungeon, like a prison with the intent to house his daughter Elizabeth, I guess forever. So this bunker was really something else. It had 4 rooms, there was plumbing, it had everything that like a low rent, shabby, illegal suite would have except for windows, and a door that locked from the inside rather than the outside. It also had a few other things that most illegal basement suites don't, like what he referred to as a rape room. The entrance to the cellar was landscaped with a lot of overgrown trees. It was closely guarded. So the tenants that lived in the housing place weren't allowed anywhere near it. And this bunker actually took him years to build it. So Elizabeth's captivity there had been planned for years. So the room that Elizabeth was originally kept in, the one where she was chained up in those early days, was actually at the end of a series of 8 locked doors and was located behind a real life kind of cloak and dagger bookshelf hidden doorway thing. So you had to crawl into the space behind this doorway. So basically, you came down the basement stairs like any regular basement. There's this utility room and then a doorway to this workshop, which is all looks very normal. And then there's this bookshelf in this workshop that hid this very heavy door that leads to a hallway, actually more like a tunnel. Um, and then this quote unquote living area, which is like this cheap kitchen table with chairs, a couple of cupboards on wheels, a hot plate, a sink. And then beyond that to the right, there's another little hallway tunnel thing that leads to this rape room, which just contains a dirty mattress, padded walls for soundproofing. There's a small bathroom. It has a toilet, sink. There's a shower stall, and then 2 bedrooms, which are literally just 2 rooms with a bed in each of them and really nothing else. But it didn't start off like that. In the beginning, it was just basically the room, this very dimly lit, damp, creepy room. She was chained to this king size bed where Joseph would come down and whatever, like over and over again, and then just leave her with scraps of food in this dark. So he left her there for the first 24 hours all by herself, no explanation. There's no natural light, no ventilation, no AC, no heat. The ceilings were so low that she couldn't stand up all the way, and she kind of had to hunch over a little bit. Mold grew, the walls were always wet, and like it was humid in there. He brought down a TV so that basically he could watch porn with her, not for entertainment. Like he made her reenact the scenes in some of the really disgusting stuff he was watching. And I mean, this was not your normal stuff. It was really sick stuff. Now, this addition to this dungeon with the extra rooms that wasn't done until after her second child was born. And her and their kids were actually the ones that had to dig these extra spaces with their hands. I mean, it took them years to do it, and it wasn't even started until she had been down there for 9 years. She couldn't reach the light switch even if she tried. Joseph would often leave her in the dark down there to purposely kind of throw her off schedule and like make her time blind. I mean, not that he needed to do that without any natural light. Like it was impossible for Elizabeth to comprehend the passage of time, whether it was day or night, summer, winter. He told her that if she tried the door, it would electrocute her and then release this poisonous gas, which she probably at that time would have preferred, but she couldn't reach the door anyways. She did obviously consider suicide or like escape plans for sure until she gave birth to Kirsten, and that just kind of gave her a purpose to protect her and to take care of her kids. Rats were common. I can't even imagine in the dark hearing those running around. She had no stimulation. It was this smelly, wet basement alone. And then when she wasn't alone, she was being beaten and raped and just, I mean, try to wrap your brain around what this captivity would have been like. I mean, she was 18 when she was taken down there, and she was 42 when she walked into the hospital. And the next time she ever saw daylight or any kind of change of surroundings, like I imagine how scary that would have been. Um, And then after a few months of being down there, like months, he finally took these chains off of her, but by this time the doors were remote controlled, so she couldn't escape anyways. And he only took the chains off because they were like getting in the way of his movement when he was doing things to her. And then she missed her period, and then another. And so Joseph at the time, he's happy about this. He thinks this is great. Like every woman wants a baby. You should be thankful for this gift that I've given you. So this first pregnancy would end in miscarriage at 10 weeks. But she soon got pregnant again, and by soon, I actually mean like 4 years after she's been in captivity there. Like she obviously she never wanted kids. She's 18 at the time. Um, but I would think that she didn't want to have her father's kid. So as she started to show, he lost interest in her, so he would leave her there to give birth completely by herself. Like he'd throw her a couple of pregnancy and birth books and then just left her there. Like I don't know if you have ever given birth, like, in a hospital with drugs and stuff, but, I mean, try to imagine never even seeing a doctor, or knowing nothing about what is happening. You're all alone in the dark. Pregnancy and birth is still considered a medical condition. Like, it is still risky. So she read that book cover to cover in this dim light. I'd be terrified as you would be. So close to her due date, he finally returned, threw her a blanket, a pack of diapers, and a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord with. And she gave birth without even so much as an aspirin for the pain by herself, terrified, a mere child. Um, I mean, I get that they say birth is a natural experience, but is it? Like, do you remember the days of trying to figure out breastfeeding and all of that without someone experienced to help you? But somehow she managed to give birth to Kirsten alone, and thankfully everything went okay. Joseph did bring formula and diapers along with food, which he bought from stores, which was a good distance away from the house so as not to raise any suspicions. And then Joseph started to consider Elizabeth and Kirsten his family, like his proper family. So he would buy them gifts, like lingerie for Elizabeth to wear when he raped her. They got a promotional notepad from the bank, which she would write the birthdays of her children on so that she wouldn't forget them. And then after Kirsten was born, he commenced raping her again now that she was skinny again. And then Stefan came along 2 years later, exact same circumstances, and then baby Lisa. But when Lisa was about 9 months old, like something was wrong and she cried all the time. And she wasn't just colicky, but like serious crying. And Joseph just couldn't stand it, thinking like someone upstairs was going to hear it. So Elizabeth begged him to take her upstairs to go to a doctor. So he came up with this plan to have Elizabeth write a letter that this cult didn't want her and couldn't take care of her, leave her on the doorstep for Joseph to find. And so that's what he did. And Joseph found Lisa in this box on their doorstep with a note saying, "Dear parents, I hope that you are all healthy. You will probably be shocked to hear from me after all these years, and with a real life surprise, no less. I'm leaving you my little daughter, Lisa. Take good care of my little girl." Now, this occult apparently didn't approve of her having more children. She mentioned that she already had a daughter named Kirsten and a son named Stefan. She begged them not to look for her. It would be useless and would only bring more harm to me and the children. So Elizabeth was completely heartbroken to have her child leave her arms, but she was at least thankful that at least one of her kids was going to have a chance to live a somewhat normal life. So Lisa would go on to have heart surgery, which would save her life. And Joseph discovered that adopting babies was great because it came with this monthly check from the government. So the same thing happened when Monica was born. So she was taken upstairs. Joseph made it so that Rosemary would find her because, Joseph finding two babies, that was a little bit suspicious. He made Elizabeth make a recording of her voice, and then he phoned the house from a payphone and then played the recording. Rosemary thought it was a little odd that they had recently changed their phone number, and Elizabeth had been able to get the number, but she figured cults, I guess they're like the CIA. And then the twins came along, and then when Michael hadn't survived and died in her arms, like she didn't know what to do in her grief. Like I can't imagine. So when he finally returned, he saw the little baby was deceased, and he's like, "Well, it's probably for the best." And then like threw his little body into this incinerator and then spread the ashes in the garden, and then took Alexander, the other twin, upstairs to be found. And lastly, Felix, who had to stay downstairs because Rosemary had his hands full upstairs with Monica, Lisa, and Alexander. The CPS never got suspicious at all. They just figured Elizabeth was a horrible person and had joined this nutty cult. And thank goodness for Joseph taking these kids in. What a great guy he is. Also, shocker, under Austrian law, his criminal record was completely wiped out after 15 years, so CPS never knew about his rapey past. Neighbors just thought that Elizabeth was this terrible person and, a slut and a bad mom, and just thought how lucky these kids were to have such a great grandfather who was going to take them in and care for them. So Elizabeth had been raising her babies, her kids, in 380 square feet, and that he had finally expanded this space to add these two tiny little bedrooms, which Elizabeth, Kirsten, and Stefan had to do most of the work on themselves. But she was happy to have the little bit of extra space. But the kids were actually terrified of it because they had never known space. So to have walls that you dig through and make more space was something that their brains just couldn't comprehend. Elizabeth did everything that she could to give her kids some kind of childhood. She taught them to read and write. She tried to make up some games. They watched TV, which they considered this fantasy world. She begged Joseph for books. But imagine growing up never knowing what grass feels like or even what a breeze feels like on your face. Like I'm just so nauseous over this story. She had to beg him to bring her vitamin D tablets to prevent rickets. Like, thank goodness she knew about those things, that she had at least been able to read books and understand some of this stuff. So by the time that Kirsten got really sick, Joseph's now in his 70s. He's not getting around as well as he was before. So in his delusional thinking, he thought, well, Christmas 2008, that's going to be a great time for this family reunion. So he told Elizabeth that he's going to be releasing her and the kids and that they would just show up from this cult and everyone would be great. It's a great Christmas present for his wife. And plus, her white hair and missing teeth and just ill repair she was in from years of torture. She just wasn't really appealing to him sexually anymore, anyways. But Elizabeth, she never really believed, like, she didn't believe that it was ever going to happen. She figured one day she was going to die down there and that they would all perish from starvation. But Kirsten got sick, and then when Elizabeth begged him to take her to the hospital, well, he decided that the time had probably come. So he did take Kirsten out. And when they started asking then for Elizabeth to come forward, he let her out to tell her cult story. Um, and I hate feeling like I skipped over so much of the daily life of those 24 years in the cellar for Kirsten, Elizabeth, and Stefan, and Felix as well. Um, but I can't comprehend it anyways. So even though I know a lot of details um, that I can provide, I just can't really grasp what life was really like for them on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. I mean, it was just hell on earth. That's all I can really say about it. But um, it's so much of a hell that the days would have just kind of blended into each other. I tell a lot of stories where I can skip over the passage of time, and then we kind of, we fast forward 2 years to when the trial starts. But I've also, like, I personally have waited for spaghetti to reheat in the microwave, so I know how slow time can actually pass sometimes. So 24 years is something I just can't, like, my brain just can't go there. I don't think there's anyone that could say, "I know how she feels." I don't think there's anything that can compare their experience to, I mean, it's not like that time you were stuck at the airport for 16 hours when your flight was delayed, you were stuck in an elevator for 3 days without food and water with a guy who talked incessantly about saltwater fishing in 1992, and I'm sorry that that happened to you, but it's nothing like their life was for 24 years, and to top off this sicko cake, he had the nerve over the years to talk about life upstairs and bring photos from their family vacations. The fucker. So one officer said he has showed no remorse for his victims. He is so arrogant that I don't even think he thinks he has done anything wrong. So the seller, when the police go to investigate this, I mean, it was horrible. The smell was completely overpowering. Like, it was like a moldy 24 years of sweat and tears and food and garbage. There are some pictures of it available online. Um, but it's better than seeing it. You would need to smell this picture, and how low the ceilings are and how tight those hallways were. They're just claustrophobic to look at, let alone imagining in it, living in it for 2 decades. So Elizabeth now, after 24 years down there, she walked with a limp. The children, including Kirsten, who did recover from her illness. She woke up from her coma after 7 weeks in a hospital bed, which must have been just absolutely terrifying to see doctors and nurses and just, I mean, light in general. They were taken to an inpatient treatment center to slowly try to integrate them back into the world. They had terrible issues with light, having never been really exposed to it. They didn't really walk properly because of years of having to walk stooped over, because the roof was so low. So as the kids grew up, they were never able to stand upright completely after a certain age. They were also terrified of open spaces. I mean, these kids had issues up the absolute wazoo. Like, they had PTSD to the 10th degree. They had never seen a car. Certainly never been in one. They never saw trees or computers, smartphones, the moon, the stars. The entire world was new to them. And as much as you'd think that they would be thrilled about the freedom. It was a lot scarier than you can ever imagine. I mean, just the sounds of door closing could send them into a panic. So the kids who lived upstairs, they never knew that they had these siblings that they had lived above for years. So they wound up having a lot of survivor's guilt. I mean, they were traumatized about being lied to. Rosemary had a nervous breakdown. So at 73, they had to find a way to put him away for the rest of his life. So he was charged with incest, rape, coercion, false imprisonment, slavery, and by neglect for the death of Michael. But he pled guilty to absolutely everything except for the murder charges. And he held this file folder over his face every time the camera's around. The court had a bunch of psychiatrists on hand for any jury members that found a lot of the testimony too hard to deal with. There was a no-fly zone put in place over the courthouse to prevent the media from intruding on this case. His indictment was 27 pages long. It was read into the court by prosecutor Christine Burkheiser, who said Joseph used Elizabeth like a toy. And then in her opening statement, she asked the jury to imagine living underground in just 11 square meters of space with just a wash bin, a sleeping corner, no warm water, no shower, no heating, and worst of all, no daylight. So the only air that Elizabeth had ever received was through the gaps in the wall. The first few years, Joseph barely even spoke to her. None of us can really imagine what it was like to be in that cellar. In the media, you will always have heard a lot about this case. Some of these details are true, some of them are not. You are obliged to pay attention only to the truth. So please try to forget what you have read up until now. Push it to one side. During this trial, you will be confronted by two sides of the story. Now, Joseph had hired this lawyer named Rudolph Mayer, who told the jury that this kindly old man was not a monster. He said, quote, "You need to keep emotions out of this, even with someone like him who has been described as a monster. It's irrelevant if he's an unsympathetic character or a monster," end quote. And he argued that he had, in fact, taken care of two families. I mean, would a monster do that? You cannot call someone who does that a monster. If you only want your daughter for sex, you don't want children. You would let them starve. I mean, he was just this really caring man who he took a Christmas tree down to the dungeon for his family and even gave them an aquarium so that they could watch the fish. The prosecution needed a conviction on the murder charge because without it, the maximum sentence that they could get for him was 15 years. But he could potentially be out in like 7 years. So, fortunately, on March 19th, 2009, Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 15 years. And he spent most of that in solitary confinement because of the nature of his charges. The Sun in the UK was able to track down some information about the surviving family in 2013. So at that time, most of the Fritzl kids were now adults, given new names. They moved to this undisclosed location. It was a two-story house. Trying to piece their lives together without having the media around. They had CCTV cameras, lots of security there. And at the time, the Sun reported that Kirsten, she loved music and clothes. She had a boyfriend. Stefan had dreams to become like a ship's captain, and Felix was doing well. He was going to go to school, and he had kids like friends that didn't know anything about his past. Now, as for the so-called upstairs children, Monica went to university, Lisa finished high school, and Alexander had hopes of going on to get his mechanical engineering degree. So Elizabeth was awarded the house, which was worth £680,000, plus a $50,000 lump sum by the state. Joseph sent her numerous letters from prison. She hasn't answered any of them. And then apparently in some of the letters, he had the nerve to ask her for money. In 2012, Joseph and Rosemary divorced. Shocker. Now, apparently he divorced her because she had stopped visiting him in prison and no longer wanted anything to do with him. The nerve. She changed her name and moved to Linz. She makes a little bit of extra money now by selling some crafts that she makes. There was friction for a while between Elizabeth and her mom, Rosemary, because, Elizabeth just had some trust issues with her mom believing all of Joseph's lies over the years about her. And, like, how could she not have known what was going on? But for most accounts, they're reportedly doing a lot better recently on reconnecting. In 2017, Joseph found himself beat up. He's missing some teeth from an attack from some other inmates. He changed his name soon after to Joseph Mehrhoff. I was happy to tell journalists that they should maybe, look in other people's basements because he's pretty sure other families have got girls down there too. As a child rapist and perpetrator of incest, I can't imagine he's really well regarded by his fellow inmates. In 2008, the house with the dungeon was sold to a developer that completely renovated it. It now rents it out, painted the building this bright orange color to kind of like, I don't know, dress up the shabbiness of it and make it less gloomy from its past. By 2019, it was rumored that in his mid 80s now he was suffering from dementia. He didn't want to live anymore. But in April of 2022, he was moved from a psychiatric detention facility to like a regular prison in March of 2023. So just this just a couple of years ago, which is also the first year that he was eligible to apply for parole. He wrote a book. Well, he co-authored with his most recent lawyer, Astrid Wagner. I won't tell you what it's called because hopefully you don't buy it. But in the book, he basically says that he's a great guy and quite the ladies' man, and he doesn't understand what all this fussity fuss is about. Reportedly in 2019, Elizabeth and her bodyguard, Thomas Wagner, which is probably not his real name, started a romantic relationship. And as far as I know, they live together today. And that was the horrible story of the Fritzl family. And I don't have anything else to say about it. I think I've said enough. So I'm going to be back again next week with another case. As always, thank you so much for watching.